The night she disappeared wasn't the kind of night you forget. There was a wind that carried whispers not of the trees themselves, but of something older, lurking beneath the shadows of her small college town. Most people slept soundly, unaware that the world was shifting just out of sight. But for the family of the missing girl, every rustle in the darkness, every creak of the old floorboards became a scream. She wasn't just gone. She had been swallowed into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though the world itself had agreed to hide her. And her name was Emily Parker, a student in her second year, bright, cautious, a girl who kept her phone on vibrate at all times. Her disappearance began as an unremarkable text chain. "I'll be back by 10. That was the last anyone heard from her. No one noticed at first that the message was unusual. In hindsight, it was the first warning. Parents and friends initially told themselves the simplest truths: traffic, a late study session, a friend's couch, but Emily had never been late before. The hours stretched into a day, then two, and then the town's sense of normality began to erode, and the police were called, and they combed the town, the surrounding woods, the riverbanks, but each lead ran cold. Cameras captured nothing. Witnesses reported nothing. It was as if she had vanished into a parallel world, leaving behind only the faint scent of something metallic, like copper or blood, in the air of her dorm room. That smell lingered just long enough to unsettle anyone who entered, before fading into nothing. And it wasn't just the family who noticed. Other students whispered about shadowed figures on the edge of campus, strangers moving too slowly to be real, faces that vanished when you blinked. The town began to notice the dark veins of fear threading through their routines. And weeks passed. A candlelight vigil drew the local community, faces hollowed by worry, but the underlying dread went deeper than loss. Something had shifted in the air, something that couldn't be explained by ordinary misfortune. Parents began hearing noises at night, doors slamming, faint cries that stopped the instant they were approached. Pets refused to enter certain rooms. Emily's bedroom remained untouched, but the energy it carried was heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her last moments. And then the messages began. Not texts, not calls, not the polite knocking of someone at the door, but slips of paper left in impossible places. A note tucked into the lining of a backpack, a word scratched into a bathroom mirror, letters that smelled faintly of iron. They weren't coherent, not at first, just fragments. Not gone. Watching. The handwriting shifted like someone, or something, was unsure how to appear human. Each note felt older than the paper it was written on, as though the act of leaving them had existed long before Emily ever walked into that dorm. And by the time investigators noticed the pattern, it was already too late. Families and friends were not only haunted by her absence, but by the growing sense that she hadn't simply disappeared. She had been claimed, absorbed into something cold and unseen, something that wore the face of the town but carried its own secrets, buried deep beneath the cheerful facades of suburban streets and college lawns. The darkness had an origin, and Emily had stumbled upon it. The story was no longer about a missing girl. It was about a town complicit in its own silences, a darkness so patient it could wait decades to reveal itself. And the search turned up nothing. No footprints in the mud beyond the edges of campus, no abandoned car, no signs of struggle in her dorm room, just the faint echo of her last movements, like a record scratched halfway through a song. Detectives began retracing her steps, the hours before her disappearance, interviewing classmates and roommates, scanning her digital footprint for anything unusual. And that's when they noticed the first anomaly. The security cameras outside her dorm didn't just fail, they had been tampered with. Frames were missing. Hours erased, a digital void where Emily should have appeared. Whoever or whatever had taken her didn't want anyone to see, and the family was desperate. Her mother, a quiet woman with a history of depression, began receiving phone calls late at night. No one spoke. There was only breathing, shallow, deliberate, followed by a click. Her father started locking doors that had never been locked before, checking windows obsessively. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a chamber of paranoia. They knew, somewhere deep down, that the answers would not be simple. The usual explanations, the runaways, the kidnappings, the unfortunate accidents, felt inadequate. Something in the way her life had been erased hinted at intelligence, at planning. Someone had thought it through, and the college tried to move on. Classes resumed, emails went out promising increased security, counselors offered support, but the students remembered. Late at night, whispers traveled through dorm halls, stories of glimpses of Emily in places she shouldn't have been. Library corners, empty classrooms. Students claimed they saw her reflection in darkened windows when no one was there. Some swore they heard her voice calling their name softly, only to vanish when they turned. Rational explanations were offered: grief, stress, sleep deprivation. But rationality felt thinner with each passing week, and weeks bled into months. The police officially listed her as missing, but the trail was cold, and the case began to sink into obscurity. That's when the first clue arrived in an unexpected form. A package delivered anonymously to the family home. Inside was a single photograph of Emily taken from a distance. But it wasn't recent. Her hair, her clothing, everything suggested it had been taken months prior, in a location no one recognized. The photograph was partially burned along the edges, and when her parents looked closely, they swore they could see faint markings in the background, symbols that resembled nothing they had seen before. A language older than the town itself, scratched into the world just behind her, and investigators were intrigued but cautious. The symbols were hard to classify. Linguists debated whether they were a code graffiti or something far older, a ritual language from forgotten communities that had lived in the forests surrounding the town centuries ago. Local historians spoke quietly about disappearances that occurred in that same area decades before, cases buried in old newspapers with no follow-up. All of them described something similar: children vanishing, neighbors reporting strange lights in the woods, families haunted by whispers that no one else could hear. Emily's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was a recurrence, a pattern buried under the surface of a town that had long since chosen to ignore it. And yet, for all this attention, Emily remained elusive, not just physically, but as a presence. She existed only in fragments, notes, photographs, rumors. She had become a ghost before anyone could even claim her body. Friends who had once shared meals and laughter with her began to speak differently, softer, as if acknowledging her name aloud might call something terrible into their lives. Even the police admitted quietly that something about the case made their skin crawl. Something beyond normal human comprehension had claimed her, and it wasn't finished, and it wasn't just the family who felt the weight of her absence. The town itself began to twist under the strain of unanswered questions. Shops reported items disappearing, doors left unlocked overnight, lights flickering in patterns no electrician could explain. People spoke of shadows moving against the grain of reality, figures slipping through alleyways where no one should have been. The older residents whispered of the eyes in the past, children lost in the same woods decades before, names that were buried in dusty archives and forgotten yearbooks. Emily's disappearance was different, visible, tangible, and yet cloaked in a darkness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the universe itself had drawn a veil over the truth. And journalists attempted to probe the story, digging into public records, police reports, and family histories. They found patterns that no one could easily ignore. Families who lived on the edge of the town, nearest to the woods and the old railroad tracks, had higher rates of disappearances. And strangely, in each of these cases there were traces, marks, symbols, fleeting photographs, whispers of voices that defied explanation. Scholars and paranormal investigators debated endlessly, but no one could offer a concrete answer. Emily's case was now part of something larger, a tapestry woven of fear, secrecy, and an invisible hand guiding events from the shadows. And at the family home, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every night, the floors seemed to shift under their weight, every mirror reflected subtle distortions, and faint scratches appeared on walls overnight, forming patterns that resembled the symbols from the photograph. Her mother, desperate for answers, began documenting these occurrences. She wrote everything down, page after page, her handwriting growing increasingly erratic, punctuated by notes like, "She's here. Watching, waitin'." Her father tried to dismiss it as grief, but he too could feel it, the heavy air pressing against his chest, the low hum that seemed to emanate from nowhere. And outside, the town carried on its charade of normalcy. Children walked to school, neighbors exchanged polite greetings, and life proceeded, oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge the darkness coiling beneath its streets. But the students who had encountered Emily's presence firsthand spoke in hushed tones. They described fleeting glimpses of her face at the edge of vision, her expression calm but somehow pleading. Hallways that had once been familiar now felt like traps. Even the bravest among them admitted that the air itself felt wrong, thick with a memory of fear that wasn't their own. And by now, investigators were convinced of one thing: Emily had become part of something that couldn't be explained by ordinary means. She wasn't just missing, she was embedded in the fabric of the town's unseen history, a link in a chain of events that repeated itself over generations. Each disappearance left a residue, a psychological scar on those left behind, as though the town itself had been chosen, cursed even, to host a darkness that fed on silence and compliance. Every time someone looked away, every time a family ignored a creaking floorboard or a shadow that lingered too long, they allowed it to grow stronger. And then came the calls. Not notes, not photographs, actual calls, every night at the same time. The line would pick up, nothing but static and breathing, and then a whisper, "Don't look." At first, the family thought it was a prank, but the pattern was too consistent, the tone too intimate. It wasn't a stranger, it was Emily or whatever she had become. Her voice was there, fractured and distant, yet unmistakably hers. The investigators who heard recordings described a chill that settled deep into their bones, a feeling that the sound itself carried weight, a presence beyond the human, and the realization hit slowly, like a drip of cold water on a fevered brow. Emily wasn't merely missing. She had been claimed, consumed in a way that left her body, and sometimes even the concept of her impossible to locate. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial anymore, it was ritualistic, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise. Investigators discovered old, almost forgotten case files from decades prior, buried in the basement archives of the county courthouse. Each file was meticulously redacted, names blacked out, dates erased, but the patterns were unmistakable. Young women, mostly college-aged, vanished under circumstances that mirrored Emily's disappearance: silent dorms, empty streets, erased hours on security tapes, and faint traces of symbols left behind, always pointing toward the surrounding woods, and the symbols themselves became a language of fear. Some historians argued they were a remnant of ancient rites, a forgotten cult that had once thrived on the outskirts of American towns. Others suggested a psychological network, descendants of trauma passed down through generations, a collective unconscious acting out through the disappearances. No matter the theory, every expert agreed on one point: there was intent. Someone, or something, wanted these disappearances to remain buried, obscured, hidden beneath layers of polite bureaucracy and local denial. Emily had stumbled into that network, and now she was a ghost in its machinery, a witness trapped behind a veil no one was meant to lift. And as the family sifted through the photographs, the notes, the audio recordings, an unsettling pattern emerged. Emily's presence was no longer entirely corporeal. She appeared in reflections, in the corner of photographs not taken by her, sometimes blurred, sometimes sharp, always watching. Her appearance changed subtly with each sighting, her expression alternating between fear and resignation. Friends began reporting dreams of her, dreams so vivid and unsettling that they woke screaming, drenched in sweat. In those dreams, Emily was always in motion, moving towards something unknown, and the world around her was always silent, suffocating and dark, and the town's response oscillated between denial and fear. Parents kept their children indoors after dark. Streetlights were installed in places that didn't need them. Surveillance cameras multiplied, but gaps persisted, hours unrecorded, feeds corrupted. Locals whispered of a shadow network that existed just beneath the veneer of normal life, where laws of time and space bent, and where Emily's disappearance was only the most recent in a series of incidents stretching back generations. Even those who had never met her began to feel a chill whenever her name was mentioned, as though speaking it aloud invoked an invisible presence. And then the unthinkable happened. A hiker miles from the campus stumbled upon a small clearing in the woods. There were no footprints, no signs of a camp, only the faint, burned edges of paper scattered across the ground. On each piece were fragments of Emily's life, her handwriting, her doodles, her signature. And there, at the center, etched into the earth itself, were the symbols from the photograph, twisted, looping, ancient. The hiker called authorities, but when police arrived, the clearing had changed. The papers were gone. The markings were barely visible, as if they had never existed. And yet, those who had seen it remembered the dread, the same oppressive weight that hung over Emily's room, her family, and the town. And it became clear that Emily's disappearance had opened a door. Once she had been claimed, something had shifted in the town, in the world around it. It wasn't merely her absence that haunted the people. It was what she had left behind, a trail of fear, a suggestion that some places, some families, were vessels for secrets far older and darker than anyone dared admit. The missing girl had become a mirror, reflecting the town's own complicity, the way ordinary people look away when something unimaginable occurs in the margins of their lives. And the whispers began to spread beyond the town. Other communities, once unaware, started reporting unusual phenomena: missing items, fleeting figures at the edge of vision, strange symbols appearing in places no one should have been. Emily's case, once local, became a warning. Experts in criminal psychology and folklore weighed in, debating whether this was the work of a human predator, a cult, or something that defied explanation altogether. Every theory seemed to circle back to the same chilling conclusion. Emily had crossed into a space that existed alongside our reality, a place where time, memory, and consciousness were manipulated by forces humans could barely comprehend, and her family's home became a repository of terror. Every object, every photograph, every scrap of paper felt imbued with her absence, as if the house itself remembered her last moments. Her parents could no longer sleep. At night they heard her footsteps pacing the hallway, her whispers repeating phrases they couldn't quite understand. They stopped leaving doors unlocked. They stopped trusting mirrors. And when the phone rang, always at the same hour, they learned not to answer. But the calls came anyway, sometimes leaving recordings, sometimes silence, but always the unmistakable presence of Emily on the other end. And local historians, digging into the archives, discovered that the town had a history of disappearing young women dating back almost a century. Records were incomplete, intentionally redacted, or destroyed. But recurring details emerged. Each disappearance involved a young woman near a place of study, usually near the edge of the woods, always with inexplicable gaps in surveillance, and always accompanied by strange, ritualistic marks. Emily had not been the first to vanish, and she would not be the last. The town's normality was a fragile mask over a persistent, gnawing horror. And in the symbols, they were everywhere once you knew to see them. Carved into trees, scratched into the pavement, inked onto pages that should have been blank. Linguists struggled to translate them. Psychologists tried to rationalize them as manifestations of trauma or mass suggestion. But the ones who saw them reported the same reaction. A tightening in the chest, a shiver down the spine, the sense that something invisible was watching, measuring, waiting. Emily had left traces that refused to be ignored, and the town, like everyone who came into contact with her story, was complicit in perpetuating the silence that allowed this darkness to grow. And by now, her friends and classmates had fractured. Some refused to speak of her at all, others whispered only in the dead of night, and a few claimed they could still see her walking the campus, always just out of reach, her eyes distant but pleading. It wasn't her physical presence, they could see her body in their minds, but an echo, a shadow of memory, repeated across time and space. Those who tried to follow her vanished into depression, paranoia, or worse. The town had begun to understand that Emily's disappearance wasn't just an event, it was a contagion. A seed planted in the human psyche that spread fear, confusion, and a strange, unrelenting compulsion to watch and remember. And at this point, the case had attracted attention from outside agencies, psychologists, occult researchers, law enforcement from other regions, but each arrival ended the same way: silence. Files disappeared, witnesses recanted, evidence evaporated. It was as if Emily's disappearance had created a pocket of influence that resisted investigation, a force that could bend perception, memory, and records themselves. And still, the family waited. Each day, each hour, their hope dwindled, replaced by the sickening certainty that whatever had taken her was patient, deliberate, and far older than they could imagine. And then came the calls from strangers. Not friends, not family, but voices on the edge of the line. Some whispered her name, others described her movements in eerie detail, as if they had watched her vanish themselves. One man claimed he saw her in a photograph taken hundreds of miles away, a blurred figure in a crowd, staring straight at the camera. Others reported fleeting glimpses in parking lots, libraries, even their own homes. Each sighting carried the same quality: Emily was there, but not really there, an echo of someone trapped between worlds. And investigators began to map these reports, and a horrifying pattern emerged. Each appearance correlated with locations connected to past disappearances: towns, campuses, forests, places where young women had vanished decades before. It was as if Emily was drawn to these points, her presence marking a trail through history that no one was meant to see. Scholars argued endlessly about what it meant. Some whispered of dimensional folding, others of a psychological contagion, but no explanation could account for the consistency, the weight, and the terror of it all. And the family's life had become a slow, grinding descent into a private nightmare. Nights were the worst. The house seemed to breathe around them, doors creaking open and shut on their own, floors sighing under invisible weight. Emily's mother began recording everything, every sound, every flicker of light, every note left behind. The recordings captured whispers that defied explanation, fragments of her voice speaking in languages no one could identify, the same symbols from the photograph recurring in the static of old tapes. Her father, once skeptical, began to barricade rooms, only to find the locks undone the next morning. And a breakthrough, or what investigators initially thought was one, arrived in the form of an old journal discovered in the town archives. It belonged to a girl who had disappeared 70 years earlier under eerily similar circumstances. Her entries spoke of the same shadows, the same whispers, the same feeling of being watched by something patient and invisible. She described symbols etched into walls and trees, people vanishing into thin air, and a sense that the town itself was alive, aware, and choosing who would be taken next. Emily's case chillingly mirrored every detail, as if she had walked into a story already written, and the psychological toll on those closest to her was immense. Friends reported dreams where Emily called to them, always from somewhere they couldn't reach. Police officers confessed to hearing her footsteps while alone in her dorm. Even the journalists covering the story began to experience unexplainable phenomena, shadows flickering just outside the edges of their cameras, distorted audio in recordings, fleeting faces appearing in crowds, staring directly at them. Emily's disappearance had created ripples far beyond the town, touching anyone who tried to uncover her story. And by now, the chilling truth was clear: Emily had not simply vanished. She had become a part of the town's dark, repeating history, a node in a network of disappearances that spanned generations. Her presence, though intangible, left a trail, symbols, whispers, fleeting images that no one could erase. And yet, the most terrifying aspect remained. There was no reason to believe this darkness was finished. Every person who glimpsed her, every note or symbol left behind, ensured that the cycle continued, patient, deliberate, and invisible, waiting for the next to stumble too close. And it was then that the truth, or at least the edges of it, began to crystallize. Experts, historians, and folklorists who had spent decades documenting the town's history all converged on one conclusion: Emily's disappearance was not random. It was a continuation of something older, something buried beneath the surface of the town itself. There were mentions in dusty newspapers and journals of similar disappearances stretching back to the 1800s. Young women vanished, sometimes in broad daylight, sometimes in the dark of night. In every account, witnesses described the same symbols, the same oppressive weight in the air, and the same sense that the world itself had shifted around the victims. Emily had walked directly into that lineage, and in doing so had become its most recent inheritor, and the family's home became a center of the investigation in its own right. Every wall, every object, every corner seemed to hum with a memory of her. Investigators documented strange phenomena. Cameras captured fleeting shadows moving independently of their sources. Recordings picked up low-frequency sounds resembling whispering, and sometimes the temperature in the rooms would drop suddenly, leaving frost on windows in the middle of summer. It was as if Emily's absence had created a vacuum, a space that bent the rules of normal perception. And friends and classmates continued to report sightings, always fleeting, always out of reach. They described her as calm but distant, a presence simultaneously familiar and impossible. The sightings seemed to follow a pattern, always near locations tied to previous disappearances, always when someone unknowingly stepped too close to the edge of the town's hidden history. One student described waking in the middle of the night to find Emily standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes hollow, whispering fragments of words that made no sense yet carried a weight of urgency. When she blinked, Emily was gone, but the memory lingered, heavy like a stone pressed into her chest, and investigators eventually found a series of old letters buried in the courthouse archives, written by a town official in the 1920s. They described strange rituals conducted in the woods, disappearances the authorities had hidden, and cryptic symbols similar to those now associated with Emily. The letters suggested a network of knowledge, a secret preserved across generations, designed to obscure a pattern of predation that was not just human, but something older, something that preyed upon the very fabric of human perception. Emily, it seemed, had unknowingly uncovered a door that the town had long tried to seal, and at this point, even the most skeptical authorities were forced to admit a chilling truth. The story wasn't simply about a missing girl. It was about the persistence of something beyond comprehension, a darkness so patient it could wait decades to reclaim its attention, yet so precise that it knew exactly how to reach its victims. Emily was not alone. She was part of a continuum, one that stretched back a century and likely continued far into the future. Every note, every sighting, every whispered phone call was a reminder that she had not vanished into nothing, but into something far more deliberate, far more sinister. And the most haunting realization, however, was the one her family slowly came to understand: this darkness was not bound by geography or time. Wherever a person glimpsed Emily, wherever her symbols appeared, it touched the world, threading fear and memory through ordinary lives. Emily's story was no longer her own. It had become a warning, a fragment of forbidden history, a story meant to unsettle anyone who dared remember it. And the question that remained, unspoken but persistent, was simple and terrifying: how long before it reached for the next?